There we are. Okay, good morning. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov, everybody. Welcome back.
The class is?
We are continuing Tzurba Ma'abanan. We are on the final share of volume 17, which is good because we're running out of books, but next week we'll have new books of volume 18, Bezrat Hashem. We're beginning a new topic today, which is Hilchot of Bishul. We started talking briefly last week, but we're going into more detail today about the Hilchot of Bishul. A number of people joked over the weekend, but we're going to be discussing how to cook on Shabbat. No, the answer is we're going to be discussing how not to cook on Shabbat, which is more complicated than you might think. We want to avoid inadvertently cooking on Shabbat and therefore transgressing the laws of Bishul. And as I said, this comes up in many, many different places, many different applications. The most obvious application is in the kitchen when it comes to food, heating food, reheating food. Sometimes it might even happen on your plate that there's a Bishul taking place, so you need to know what Bishul is and how to avoid that at different scenarios. It also comes up, one of the examples the Rambam gives from the definition of Bishul is heating water. So when we heat up water, when we turn on the hot water tap, with shemesh, with chashmal, these are all questions which are very, very significant, relevant, and practical questions related to the halachot of Bishul. So again, the way that we're going to go through, we're going to build it up as we always do, build it up from the principles. Of course, it's going to take a little bit of time before we will mention practical questions as we go on. But it takes a little bit of time when you have a lot of different principles, a lot of different ideas, which we need to know. We need to kind of build up the picture first, and then we can start looking at how they all apply. Throughout this share and throughout the shirim, again, if people have, I'm sure there are many things on people's minds, many questions. So I would ask you to maybe write them down or maybe submit them in between the shirim. If there are specific, particular questions related to Bishul that people would like to address, feel free to send an email, send a WhatsApp, send to me, and we'll make sure to get to those in due course throughout the shirim. So let's kick off. We begin on page 295. We did see this last week, but we'll just see very, very briefly again. And again, one of the things, just by way of introduction, mentioned last week as well, there are laws of Bishul d'Oraita, and there are laws of Bishul d'Rabanan. In other words, Bishul we know is one of the 39 melachot, of Shabbat, and that is a Torah prohibition. Beyond that, Rabbanan instituted a number of gzerot, the most well-known among them, what's called chazara, sheiyah, chazara, and hatmana, different forms of heating up food or leaving food on the fire in a way where it's already been cooked. It's already been cooked, so there is no biblical prohibition, but Rabbanan said, if you are engaged in these activities, we're worried you might come to soak the coals. We'll see what the application of that is nowadays with different technological methods of cooking. We're worried it might. We'll see what you're doing, and then even though what you're doing is not a biblical violation, other people will come to cook, and therefore there are always these two levels. So we will get to the laws of Bishul d'Rabanan later on, and that's going to involve all the questions of putting food on the hot plate and taking food off and putting it back on, etc. But before we can get to that, we have to know what is Bishul d'Oraita. And those questions are only going to be relevant when I'm certain that there is no prohibition of Bishul d'Oraita in the first place. So let's build it up step by step. The first thing to note, we mentioned last week that the language in the Mishnah, and you can see this in source number 1, the language in the Mishnah when it talks about the 39 melachot, it does not mention the melacha of Bishul, but it mentions the melacha of ofer, of baking. And we'll see as well when we get into the laws of cooking after cooking, Bishul achar Bishul, there may actually be a difference between Bishul achar Bishul and Bishul achar Achiyah, but nonetheless it uses baking. Why does it use baking? There, because the Gemara explains that when the Tana listed the different melachot, he listed them in the order of baking, the sequence of baking bread. Maybe that's related to the lechem apanim in the Mishkan. Maybe it's just related to the fact that it's an easier way to remember. A list of 39 melachot is quite a lot to remember, and therefore we find throughout the Mishnayot, and remember this was Torah Sheba'al Peh, because I'll establish it in such a way, using mnemonics, using memory tricks, etc. So it's an easier way to remember the sequence of preparing bread, and therefore it says ofer versus bishul. But we generally accept that they are interchangeable. Interesting, by the way, that the Yerushalmi says that the av melacha is bishul and the tolada is ofer. So we discussed in a previous year the difference between avot and toladot, melachot. I'm not going to repeat that now. Both are still d'oraita. So that would be that's the definition of the Yerushalmi. In any event, and we saw that the Rambam said So the Rambam said that Bishul does not just apply to food, it applies to substances as well, certainly applies to water, but it could apply to metal or tar, for example. Anytime through fire, through heat, you soften a hard object or make hard a soft object, that would be the Malacha of Bishul, according to the Rambam, and that is in source number 3. Let's go on to page 297. Let's get right into it. So what is the definition of Bishul? So the first thing we have to understand, we always need to differentiate between solids and liquids because they work differently and they're going to be different parameters and different definitions. So at what stage do I say that a food is cooked? I start off with a food that is raw, or in the case of a liquid where it's cold, raw, essentially. At what stage do I say it now becomes, has reached the level of cooking? In other words, I'm going to be liable for what I do. When it comes to food, and we'll see this later on, but when it comes to food solids, we have what's called Machal Ben Rosai. Machal Ben Rosai was a bandit. Everybody wonders, why was it this robber? Why did he have the merit? But in Hilchot Shabbat, we always remember his name. But the point is, he was a bandit and he was always in a rush to make a quick getaway. So he didn't wait for his food to be fully cooked. Machloket in the Rishonim, whether he ate his food, it was half cooked or it was a third cooked. Okay, but it's good that that's the minimum amount where we say what's called achilani ve'atcha. That if you need to, you could eat it. It's not completely raw yet. And if you reach that stage of cooking, that is considered that you have cooked from on a Torah level on Shabbat. Interesting question which comes up, which we won't discuss today, we'll get to later. But the interesting question is, if you have food that is at the stage of Machal Ben Rosai, and then you cook it, you complete the cooking, would that also be a violation? Okay, so that's going to be a machloket. By the way, Machal Ben Rosai comes up not just by Shabbat, it comes up in the realm of Bishul Akum, also relevant there. That is for solid. When it comes to liquids, what is considered cooking? What is considered cooking when it comes to liquids? So here we go by heat, we go by the temperature. And the problem is, like many different shiurim which we have, Chazal do not give us, they didn't have thermometers, etc. in those days. We try and put this in degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit if you prefer, but it's the same thing. But it's not so clear exactly what the temperature is. So let's look, source number 4. Masechet Shabbat. The Gemara tells us as follows: Tanu Rabbanan, Mevi Adam Kiton Mayim Umenicho Keneged Medorah. So you can take a jug of water, cold water, and you can place it near the fire. Lo b'shvil shechamu, ela b'shvil shetafik tzinatan. Says the Gemara, you are allowed to place it opposite the fire in such a way, not so that it's going to heat up, and not that it's going to be boiling and it's going to cook, but in a case just to take the edge off, right? Maybe temper the cold. That is what is permitted. Again, I'm not getting into now discussions of in terms of midrabanan, what's going to look like cooking and how do you put it on, etc. That we'll get to later. But the first stage is in terms of that we're not actually coming to cook midoraita. So it says you don't put this directly on the fire, you put it near the fire, so it's going to heat up a little bit. What does that mean, a little bit? So have a look at the second paragraph here in the Gemara. The Gemara here has a discussion regarding water, regarding oil. Okay, so it says echad shemen ve'echad mayim, whether it's water, oil, whatever it is. Yad soledet bo asur. Everybody's heard of yad soledet. Okay, that is when this water is going to reach the temperature of yad soledet bo. Your hand would recoil from it. That is going to be forbidden. That is now considered cooking. That's now being cooked on a doraita level. Ein yad soledet bo. But if it's lower than yad soledet bo mutar, that is going to be permitted. Okay, what does yad soledet bo mean? Okay, any water that could cause the baby's belly to be scalded, that is the temperature that we're talking about. Okay, go and try this at home. That's just to give us a measure of how much it would be. Now, when the Gemara says you can place the water near the fire in such a way that it's going to get below this temperature, what are we talking about? Does it mean to say that you could place the water there and you just remember, you can't set an alarm, it's on Shabbat, but you remember, you're going to go back before it reaches that, theoretically it could reach that temperature, but I'm going to take it away before it gets to that temperature. Or we're saying, no, you place it in a way, it's not directly on the fire, it's near the fire, where the heat won't reach it, and it will never reach that temperature, intrinsically cannot reach. Which one is permitted? We'll see later on. That's going to be a machloket rishonim, exactly what the case of the Gemara is.
That would be like a blech.
Huh?
That would be like a blech that's basically set from the get-go to not reach beyond a certain temperature.
Yeah, exactly. So the Rishonim asked, so that's exactly the question. The Rishonim ask, because ultimately, if you put it on top of the blech, you leave it there for long enough, if the water's going to heat up, the question is, leave it somewhere where theoretically, if it's there for long enough, it will reach that temperature. Can I leave it there if I know I'm going to take it off before? Or do I say, no, I can only I have to place it further away or lower the temperature so that it can't theoretically get it. That's the question. But before that, we want to know what exactly is this temperature? What is this Yad Soleil? We're saying once we hit Yad Soleil, cooking is taking place. If it's below Yad Soleil, no cooking is taking place. So the Achronim, try and put a number on this, try and work out exactly how much it is. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, source number 5, Minchat Shlomo, he says that it's 45 degrees Celsius. Okay, where does he get that in? We can convert it. What is that in Fahrenheit?
45 is 119.
119. Okay, 130. It says here 113. 113 Fahrenheit or 45 degrees Celsius. Okay, where does he get that number from? And again, you see, we know that the Divrei Torah are all connected, right? You go from one sugya to the other. Where are you going to find for Yad Soleil in terms of cooking? By the way, these temperatures are significant, not just in terms of Hilchot Shabbat, but also in terms of Hilchot Bishul Ve'eter, in terms of Hilchot Kashrut and Basar V'Chalav and washing things up and mixing things together. So he learns it out from, there's a Gemara in Chulin, which talks about Shchita. The Gemara in Chulin talks about the knife which you use for Shchita, about whether the knife absorbs the taste, right? Whether the knife becomes treif or not. And it says that it says that the Beita Shchita, the area where the Shchita takes place, i.e. the neck of the animal, is not considered hot. It's considered cold. In other words, we derive from there that it's less than Yad Soleil. There is no transfer of time. Says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, we know nowadays that the temperature of a duck is 40. That's one of the animals you could do Shchita. We know that a duck is 45 degrees, and therefore, if it's 45 degrees, that's what the Gemara called tzonen. It said it's not yet hot. Cooking is not taking place, and therefore we can assume that 45 degrees is the minimum amount at which, or 45 degrees is the maximum amount we know, which we still have not yet reached Yad Soleil. See in source number 5, he says Nirela Nitati Raya Brura. The Adam 45 malot Celsius enachush klal shayad Soleil bo gam doraita. There is no up to 45 degrees. There is no concern whatsoever. But to say as well, this is an objective measure, not a subjective measure. Clearly, when Chazal gave us these measurements. So there's one person who can wash dishes and puts their hand in very, very hot water. Another, what we're going to say, for one person cooking is taking place, for another person there's not. No, that's the siman, but we have to establish what it is. So he says, right, that's the Gemara, discusses the Beit HaShchita, the net, whether it's classified as hot or cold. בית השחיטה רותח, מובא שם בגמרא, אין הסכין בולע, אלא בגמר שחיטה. The knife only absorbs at the end of the shchita, not at the beginning, and therefore, he goes through, he does the cheshbon, as we said, he comes to 45 degrees. There are others, Rav Bishul or Tzion, source number 6, he says no. He says the Gemara said, right, that it didn't just say Yad Soleil, it said Kol Shekrei Sol Shel Tinoch Nichveh. And he said that temperature would be surely at 40 degrees, you would have reached that. So it can't be 45 degrees. He says one has to be stringent even for 40, maybe even for less. And he says, so how do we explain that Gemara? Have a look, just the last 2 lines in source number 6, the bottom of page 299. It says Rav Bishul, says Ela Nireh שמחלוקתם עם בית השחיטה דינה כדין חם או כדין סונן וכמו שנתפעל. This is a very, very interesting point, which we'll get onto later. We talk about making tea on Shabbat. We have to the idea of kli rishon, kli sheni, kli shlishi. The question all the time, when we say whether it's hot or whether it's cold, do we mean in reality that it's hot or that it's cold? Or are we talking about a halachic reality, which doesn't necessarily matter? We're saying this halachically is not considered hot enough to that it should cook, but it could still be that we say it is hot, but it's not cooking. Now, this is the famous question which comes up. Talk about Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi. As I say, we'll talk about in a later shir. But the Rishonim discuss Kli Rishon, right? The first vessel, i.e., that is the pot which has had the food in, which is cooked, which was on the fire. That is considered a Kli Rishon. You have a Kli Rishon ala esh. You have a Kli Rishon which has been taken off the fire. When I pour food or water from that pot into the second pot, into a cup, or whatever, that is called a Kli Sheni, right? So the question is, does a Kli Sheni cook or not? And we find in the Gemara that says Kli Sheni eino mavasha, that a Kli Sheni does not cook. So the question everybody asks is, I don't understand. If the water is exactly I pour water from there into my cup, right? And it's exactly the same temperature. Now I put the tea bag in. Okay, well, I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger. We'll get to making tea on Shabbat in a future show. But what's the difference if it was in the Kli Rishon or the Kli Sheni? It's exactly the same temperature. So we say no. So it could be, even though it's the exact same temperature, halachically there's a difference, and we consider that not cooking. That discussion in the Rishonim, Achronim, we'll see that later on. I just mentioned that because it's related to what the Or L'Tzion says. Okay, so he says we have to be worried about 40 degrees Celsius. There are those who say that the temperature of 40 degrees comes from when we milk a cow. Apparently, the Rabbi Tzurba writes that the temperature of the milk is 40 degrees, and that's considered cold. Okay, Rav Moshe Feinstein, he's quite well known. He says here at the bottom, he's not sure what it is, but he says it's somewhere between 43 degrees Celsius and 71 degrees Celsius. Okay, between 110 Fahrenheit and 160 Fahrenheit. Now, why does he give me two measurements? Why do I need that? Because when we're looking at the degree of Yad Soledet, we need a minimum measure and a maximum measure. He says you should be stringent in both directions. What do I mean, stringent in both directions? So the lower temperature is, when am I concerned that cooking has taken place? I've placed my water near the fire, and I want to know that it's most definitely not going to be cooked. So I have to be concerned that by the time it gets to 43 degrees, that is already cooking. On the other hand, we'll see later, if I have food, let's say which was on the fire, and I take it off, let's say I have soup which was on the fire, and now I take it off, and I want to put it back on. Okay, we'll get to this later on. But I want to put it back on. Now it's already cooled down. So there are a number of conditions as to when I can put it back on or not. But if it's already cooled down, and now I put it back on the fire, so then I'm cooking it again. So I need to know that it's still hot. So there, we'd have to be stringent for the higher temperature. Over there, say if it goes below 71 degrees, so now I'm concerned that now maybe it's not cooked, and therefore I'll have that problem. So 43 to 71, that is Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, just to go back to the question that we started off with on this, which is where the Gemara said that you can place the water near the fire. So have a look at Tosfot in source number 8. He says, Nerela Rashba, by the way, the Rashba that is quoted, we know, usually we talk about the Rishon, the Rashba, which is Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderech of Barcelona. That is the Rashba, the famous of the Rishonim. When Tosfot quotes Rashba, that is talking about a different Rashba. That is one of the, that is Rav Shimshon ben Avraham al-Sens. So shouldn't be confused, not the same Rishon. But he says, Nerela Rashba, that which we say you're allowed to place the water near the fire, meaning it's far enough away, and it makes sense, because what are we saying? You're allowed to place the water and leave it there. You might forget. You put the water there, you're going to come back 10 minutes later, and in the interim, I don't know, the baby starts crying, and you go and make a bottle, and you go and change the nappy, or whatever it is, and before you know it, oops, I forgot I've got this water, and now it's cooked. So he says, you have to leave it in such a way, in such a place, where it's never going to reach that temperature. But if you place it closer, asur, if you love shear, then you can't place it there, even just to let it go. Maybe you'll forget and leave it there until it cooks. That's how Tosfot understands. The Ran has a more lenient view of the Gemara. He says, even if you place it very close to the fire, a place where it could reach that temperature, right? So long as you don't leave it for long enough, so long as you take it off, but you could put it there in the first place. So the Ran there is lenient, the Tosfot is more stringent. We'll see the Shulchan Aruch seems to hold like Tosfot, the more stringent view. And you'll see here, source number 10. This is the Shulchan Aruch again in Siman Shin Yud Chet. I mentioned last week, whenever you start learning a Hilchot Shabbat, everybody in all the Kollel, they start with a Hilchot Bishul. One of the reasons is because right at the beginning, Reish Nun Gimel, the Shulchan Aruch starts talking about Hilchot Bishul. But there he's talking about Hilchot Bishul Midrabanan. He's talking about what you can put back on the fire and what you can't put back on the fire. Because he is going in the chronological order, starting from Friday afternoon to Friday night. It's only when we get to Shin Yud Chet much later on that we actually get to the fundamentals and the principles of Bishul. And that's why we're starting here, because this is Bishul Doraita. So he says, Mutar liten kiton shal mayim or shal mashkim keneged ha'esh lafik tzunatam. You can place a jug of water or other liquid near the fire in order to temper the coal. בלבד שיתנם רחוק מהאש בעניין שאינו יכול להתחמם באותו מקום. But you need to place it far away enough so that it can't be, it's not going to reach the heat.
In terms of the Ran, he's probably the biggest cooler, because he allows us to put it really close to the fire. So if you forgot about it and you come back and you find that it's basically cooking, are you allowed to use it? Would he allow you to use it, or he basically says, no,
that's a good question. So we would say no. We would say you wouldn't be. But he's saying you can't. I mean, that's according to the Ran that would be allowed. But Shulchan Aruch is saying you can't do that. He's saying you need to place it far away enough from the fire that even if I forget about it, it won't reach the heat of cooking.
Right, according to the Ran.
According to the Ran, yeah.
You would not be able to use it if you forgot about it. If you let it go.
If you let it go, presumably you would not.
You'd lose it.
Yeah, that would be. Well, you'd have to wait for it to cool down. Yeah, wait for it to cool down again. So that's he says. Just the last couple of lines here on the Shulchan Aruch says, don't place it close enough to the fire that it could cook. Now, again, we're not talking. We'll get to this in a later share, just because we've seen these sources. I have to say, because otherwise we'll get confused. We're not talking here about the case of standard place of the hot plate. Right? If I have my soup, which I've heated up before Shabbat, and I'm placing it on the hot plate before Shabbat, and it's boiling, and it's going to stay boiling, that's a different sugya. That's not what we're dealing with now. Again, here we're talking about placing it on Shabbat. If you place it before Shabbat, even if it's going to get cooked, that, from a Torah perspective, certainly there's no problem with that. And but this is one of the sources from where we learn in terms of placing things directly on the fire, or placing it next to the fire, or using a separation with a hot plate, etc. But that's going to be a din rabbanan. We'll get to that. We'll get to that later on. Right now, our question is taking a cold liquid on Shabbat to place it onto a fire where it's going to reach Yad Soledet for. That is forbidden. That's what that's what we're talking about. Okay. So that is the first, background, first fundamental principle in terms of when is considered cooking. Let's now talk about not the temperature, but let's talk about the medium. Talk about the heat source. Okay, and here we have a very famous Mishnah in Shabbat, so page 302. Okay, which talks about cooking either by the heat of fire or cooking by the heat of the sun. Okay, you'll say, who cooks in the sun nowadays? Probably very few people. But this is going to have very, very practical ramifications, particularly for microwaves and other similar things. So the Mishnah in source number 11 says as follows. It says, "Ein notnin beitza b'tzad ha'mecham b'shvil shetitgalgel v'lo yafkiana b'sudarin v'Rabbi Yossi metir." Okay, so the Mishnah here gives an example of an egg, but really it relates to any type of raw food which you're going to cook. It says, don't place an egg next to an urn full of hot water, next to a heat source that's placed on the fire. Titgalgel literally means to roll, but yeah, it means it's going to start roasting, it's going to start cooking. So we cannot cook an egg from the heat of the urn. You also may not break it over cloths. What does it mean, cloths? So Rashi explains here, look at Rashi number 12. You have this cloth, which was heated in the sun. It was a very, very hot day outside. You let this cloth is now roasting, and you break the egg over that. What happened there? You are still cooking the egg, but here you're using the heat not of the fire, here you're using the heat of the sun. Nonetheless, says the Tanakama, that is still forbidden. But Rabbi Yossi matir. But Rabbi Yossi allows. Okay, so we have a machloket between Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi regarding whether I can cook this egg using these cloths which were heated by the sun. So the Gemara explains what exactly is their argument about. Source number 13. It says, okay, let's skip the first paragraph. Last two lines of page 302. Amar Rav Nachman, B'chama d'kulei l'plegi d'shari. We'll talk in a moment about why that is. But Rav Nachman says, everybody agrees, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbanan, everybody agrees you can cook in the heat of the sun. That is not considered cooking on Shabbat, on a Doraita. But Todota ur means fire. So in derivatives of fire, that's like a case of the mecham. I had something which was heated up by fire. I had a pot which was heated up by fire. Now the pot is off the fire, but it's still boiling water, and I'm putting it in there. Right? Kule alma loplegi dasi. Everybody there agrees that that is forbidden. Kiplegi, what is the machloket? Betodot chama. When it comes to the derivatives of the sun, mar savar gazrinan todot chama. Atu todota ur, umar savar lo gazrin. Mar and Mar as the sages and Rabbi Yossi. Meaning the one opinion says that we're concerned because of todota chama. You might come to confuse them with the derivatives of the fire. I'll explain in just a moment. And one opinion says we are not concerned. Okay, so essentially what we have is like this. There are four potential heat sources when it comes to cooking. You have to see how other things fit into this. But the two primary sources and two secondary sources. A primary source is the heat of the sun or the heat of fire. And then I have the secondary source, which is a derivative from the heat of the sun or a derivative from the heat of fire. What is a derivative? It's a secondary object. It can be a pot, it can be a cloth, it can be whatever, but that has been heated up by said primary source. So when it comes to the primary sources, there is no question. Everybody agrees that cooking in fire is forbidden. Everybody on a Torah level. Everybody agrees that cooking in the sun is permitted on a Torah level. That's not called cooking. We'll have to explain exactly why, but that's what we see. When it comes to derivatives, that's where it starts to get, that's the machloket in the Mishnah. A derivative of fire, everybody agrees that we judge the same as fire, and that is still forbidden. When it comes to derivative of the sun, so one argument is to say, if the sun is permitted to cook, it's permitted to cook in the sun, obviously it's permitted to cook in the derivatives of the sun. The other side says, wait a minute. I'm cooking, right? I have these objects. I look at them, nobody knows whether they heated up by the fire or they heated up by the sun. So if I say that it's permitted, then people are going to think, you can cook in derivatives of the sun, you can cook in derivatives of fire, therefore it's all going to be. So that's the machloket between them, and that's why we say that derivatives of heat from the sun is still going to be forbidden to cook, even though cooking in the sun itself is going to be permitted. Okay? Now, the two very, very practical questions that are going to come up for us as related to this, because nobody's going to stand, outside in the sun and make their omelette. But almost, but where this is going to be very, very relevant is number one which is maybe more obvious and one which might be more surprising. The obvious one is the question of a good shemesh, right? Using a good shemesh where the water is heated by, the water is heated by the sun, it's heated by derivatives of the sun. Okay, we'll see. It's not as straightforward as you might think, but that's going to be one nafkamina in terms of whether I can use hot water from the good shemesh on Shabbat. That's one question. The other question...
The sun is a ball of fire. The core of the sun is a ball of fire. This happens to travel 93 million miles in the form of rays, So is that a makol or is the ray a derivative?
Okay. So we're going to see. So we have to understand why do we say that the sun is different to fire? Okay, but the fact is that the way that we relate to it, meaning, right? We see fire, as a certain way, and we see the rays of the sun. There's a different method. We relate to that as two different things. But when it comes to rays and different things, so this is the other less obvious one, is the question, which was a tremendous machloket in the last generation, is relating to microwave ovens.
It's an example of the makol is fire,
right?
And you heat by the sun's rays, which is not literally fire, and the microwave is a parallel
So we'll see. So the microwave is going to be a big enough come in, and it's going to depend on the reason why do we say that the sun is not considered cooking, and that's going to be big enough come in. So let's see. Over the page 304. Why do we say that the sun is not considered cooking? So we have the Eglei Tal. Eglei Tal was the Sokhtova Rebbe. He wrote a book called Eglei Tal. Tal, right? If you reverse the letter, there's Lamed Tet. That's the gematria of Lamed Tet Malachot. Amazing. Lamed Tet is the gematria of Lamed Tet. But anyway, so that's Tal, and it's a tremendous sefer where he goes through each one of the Malachot. And very, very important sefer in terms of halakha l'maaseh as well, and a lot of interesting discussion. Then he really works through the yesodot. We spoke once about the introduction to the Eglei Tal. It was a fantastic introduction which he writes through his book. Talks a little bit about Hilchot Shabbat, but he talks about many other things as well. You see his humility, you see some tremendous things. One of the things that's quite well known, because he writes there in that Hakdamah, that there was a prevalent opinion in his day, it didn't look that long ago, but there was a prevalent opinion which said that what is limud Torah lishma? What is the ultimate form of limud Torah, which is pure and without any vested interest? So there were those who said that if you enjoy your Talmud Torah, that's called limud shelo lishma. It should be right. It's got to be amal. You have to work harder. It has to be. You have to suffer through your learning, right? I'm exaggerating slightly, but there was such an opinion, and the Eglei Tal writes against this. He doesn't. We know who said it, but he doesn't mention out of respect to the one who said it. He doesn't say who it was, but he says this is absolute nonsense. He says limud lishma. He says the greatest limud is where you enjoy it. You have to enjoy it because it's only what you enjoy that you'll actually carry on, and only that way you'll remember it. And he talks about how you learn, you have to find a way. It's when you enjoy the learning, that is when it will be, he says, more. It becomes a part of you. It's in your bones, it's in your blood, it's part of right? That's the ultimate form of lishma. He says that is not a vested interest. To the contrary, that's exactly what limud Torah is meant to be. So that is the Eglei Tal. So he says here the following. He says, why should it be that cooking via the heat of the sun is not considered cooking? Look in the second paragraph. He says, "Be'ulam shel dvarim, deyesh chiluk ben im yesh shinui ba'anaseh or shinui rak ba'oseh." It's because we find by other melachot, when you do it in an unusual manner, certainly Rabbanan, it's still going to be forbidden. She says, when we talk about a shinui, we talk about a different way of performing the melacha, right? He says there's a distinction whether yesh shinui ba'anaseh is the shinui in terms of what has been done, in terms of the result, or shinui rak ba'oseh. Or the shinui is only in the action of the one who's performing it. If I write something, I write with my right hand or I write with my left hand, so the shinui in terms of how I'm writing, but at the end of the day, the words are still going to appear on the paper. Right? Maybe not, but depending on how well you write with the other hand. But or if I'm carrying something, right? So I carry with my hand, or I carry it under my arm, or whatever it is, but I'm still carrying object is still getting from Reshut HaYachid to Reshut HaRabim. Yeah, he says, Me'ata. המבשל בחמה, כיוון ישבח עצים בפת, ותבשיל כשיבשל באש, ישבח אש בתבשיל. So when you cook something in fire, the fire gets into what we call shvach etzim, the praise of the improvement of that food comes from the fire. Right? Everybody knows if they cook a burger in the oven or you cook it a la esh, right, on a barbecue, it's different. It's a different effect. So he says, והוא שינה לבשל בחמה, ששבח החמה בתבשיל, יש שינוי בבישול הנעשה. Says the Eglei Tal, if I cook through fire, that is the outcome, the way that the food is cooked is going to be different if I'm cooking in the sun. It's a poorer quality of cooking. ועל כן המבשל בחמה, כיוון שיש שינוי בנפעל, מותר לכתחילה. It's not that there's a difference in the way that I am doing it and coming to the same outcome. It's a different outcome. It's a different effect, and that is not called cooking. That's how he explains, and that's how the Eglei Tal understands that there is no prohibition in terms of cooking in the sun. Now, others don't accept this. I actually forgot to say, if you just go back for a moment to page 303, where the Gemara said that cooking in the sun is permitted. So Rashi says over there, he says, the Shari, the Ein Derech Bishul Baka. Right? And these four words of Rashi, much ink has been spilled over the ages. What does that mean? This is not the way of cooking. It's not the typical way of cooking. So the egg leital understands it to mean that the outcome is different. It's not the way that you cook. You cook in fire, you get result A. You cook in the sun, you get result B. It's not the same. And then an omelet that's been cooked in the sun, but maybe it doesn't taste as good as an omelet that's in a frying pan on the stove. Okay, that is the egg leital. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein has a very different understanding of Rashi. Rav Moshe Feinstein understands that when Rashi says "ein derech bishul b'kach," it means that's not the ordinary way that people cook. How do you cook? You stand over your stove, you put the food in the oven, you cook in the kitchen. Who goes outside and puts a frying pan on the ground and tries to cook in the heat of the sun? Nobody looks like that. What if, for whatever reason, right, the world changed? Let's say there was a power outage, we didn't have electricity for months, and people decided, okay, the way that we're now going to cook is cooked by the sun. So according to Rav Moshe Feinstein's understanding, if that becomes the ordinary way, according to the egg leital, no, that's just, you're not cooking, you're doing something else, but that's not cooking. According to Rav Moshe Feinstein, the derech bishul means the ordinary way that people cook. If that becomes the ordinary way that people cook, it's going to be forbidden on a Torah level. Okay? Now, we don't expect anybody to go around and start cooking in the sun. But says Rav Moshe Feinstein, we have this thing called the microwave oven. And it's interesting, you see there are a few tshuvot which Rav Moshe has relating to technology, to new technology in his day. And sometimes he didn't quite get it right in terms of the technological prediction, but the principles that he said are still remain. So he actually says, nowadays, right, they've just come out with this thing and this microwave, and people still cook mainly in their the big ovens. But this is so much easier, it's so much more convenient. I'm sure the time will come when this is the way everybody's going to be cooking. And when everybody uses their microwave to cook, that's going to be in a So have a look. Source number 18. This is the Ibn Moshe. Hinei b'dvar bishul b'chama, top of page 306. He says, Delei ka'isur b'shabbat. Okay, quotes Rashi, quotes the Ran, right, ein b'bishul b'kach. ופשוט משום דני שהבישול של המשכן היה באש, מכל מקום היה שייך למלך גם בישול על ידי חמה יותר לדעת. Okay, let's skip that. Let's go to bold. אבל כיוון שעל כל פנים אין מבשלים בחמה, אלא כשאין לו עצים, אין למלך אותו מבישול על ידי האור. He says, at the end of the day, this is not the way that people cook. Why would a person cook in the sun? Only because they don't have wood, because they're in extenuating circumstances. But that's not the way you would cook, and therefore, we don't derive this from cooking by fire. Everything goes back. We know with all the avot malachot, it's related to what was done in the Mishkan. I think we mentioned in a previous year as well. There is a big discussion throughout the Rishonim and the Achronim to what extent do we require a similarity to the way something was done in the Mishkan in order for it still to be a Torah prohibition. But clearly, we do things. There are things which are involved in the 39 Malachot, which are very different from the way they were done in the Mishkan. What is the extent of similarity that's required? Okay, it's a very, very broad topic, but he just touches on that. But he says that cooking in the sun is just so different. It's not the way that people do it, and therefore it's not considered a prohibition. Let's skip again to bold in bold near the bottom. He says, microwave oven. שטוב לבשל בו כמו באש ממש. We should have said maybe by introduction. The microwave that's not fine. Right? It's the way, the mechanism, the way in which it cooks. Again, we have waves, and it's the particles certain particles in the food themselves that eat it up, and those eat the others. But it's a different mechanism to fire. He says, "Tov levashel bo kmo b'esh mamash." Okay, you could argue with this one culinary perspective, but he thinks that one could theoretically cook in this the same way that you could cook normally. The elu sheyesh lem tanuk kevzeh mishtamshim bo yoter mibishul b'esh. So I was alluding to earlier. Maybe that's not the case anymore. Because those who have such an oven would use it the same, maybe even more. Ma shelon pashtut anurim elu adaynu mishum de lo matzu yadayin habeit anurim. Says, right, when he's writing this, he says it's not so common yet. But obviously everybody's going to use them. Okay, this was in 1971. So as I say, historically this was that suggestion was not borne out. But in any event, he says, in other words, bottom line is Says Moshe Feinstein, it's all about what is considered the ordinary way and the ordinary usage. Different microwave is a way that people would normally use to cook. So he's kosher for that, for Bishul D'Oraita. On the other hand,
You back it up a step though. We're talking about it as if it's equivalent, but I mean, you have to turn on a microwave. It's not like you have like a fire that's thing with the pot next to it. I mean, there's no, you add some like halal in the microwave. You never get so far as to consider the microwave come out anyway.
right, so there are side issues, meaning with a microwave again, in terms of electricity, in terms of electricity and the clock and the screen and the noise and the buttons and all of that. Okay, so that's a side issue. Yeah. But what would be the nafkamina? The nafkamina would be okay. So you're right. So you can't do that. First of all, mentioned last week that there was a question that sometimes comes up. Somebody has, especially say, or somebody is sick, or somebody has a non-Jewish helper at home, in terms of heating up the food, or somebody's sick, or in hospital settings and things like that. So then we would say that right, that's not considered cooking in that sense. It may also be an afkamina in terms of when we get to the question of bishul achar bishul, right? Cooking after cooking. Do I say, let's say somebody prepares rice in a microwave, for example, okay? If I consider that's to be bishul, so then I say the food's already been cooked. But if I say that cooking in a microwave, since this is not bishul at all, maybe then that would be a different question of bishul.
I think the microwave is really just a parallel to the sun. I mean, they're very similar. I mean, you don't have to turn it on. You don't have to, the lights going on, but the mechanism by cooking, whether it's microwave or solar ray, is really the same concept.
Exactly. And therefore, so that is why we would say that our starting point, our default position is that cooking in a microwave is exactly the same as cooking in sun, which means it's not cooking. Again, there are side issues here in terms of operating it, so we aren't going to permit that. But the question is, can that ever change? So according to the Eglei Tal, the answer is no, that cannot change, and it will never be considered cooking. According to Moshe Feinstein, in the same way he says, if this is an ordinary method of cooking, the truth is there's another layer that we could add to it, right? Because we could say, even according to Moshe, if we now fast forward, 50 years, 60 years, and a microwave is used for heating food up, but it's not the regular form of cooking, maybe even according to his shita, it would still not be cooking d'oraita. But the point is that according to him, it could change. It could change if it becomes the normal way. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, by contrast, says no. He says we have to go back and we have to look at cooking which was done in the Mishkan, which was done by a fire, was not done by the sun, was not done by other mechanisms. And therefore, intrinsically, the sun, we don't consider fire, a microwave, we don't consider fire, and therefore that is not going to be cooking d'oraita. I don't care if that's what most people do, or that's the normal way of cooking, or that's not the normal way of cooking. That is not cooking, because that is not fire. And that's Shlomo Zalman. I think you have it here in, actually, if you go back, it's talk number 17, he talks about it. Okay, we won't look at it inside right now. But the point is that because of them, because of all of those factors, so we aren't going to allow operating a microwave oven on Shabbat. We might still be concerned for cooking. We're also worried about the external reasons. But you're in a hospital setting, you're in other places, etc. And that's better than using other things. Have a look at Hilchot Yosef, source number 20. Page 308, he says, "Asur levashel b'Shabbat machshir ha'mikrogal." We can fast forward a few decades now. It's not called a microwave oven anymore. Now it's called a mikrogal. All right, or the turbogal. Af im hupalu al yedei shon Shabbat. Even if you had a shon Shabbat, turn him on. Okay. Ve'en hakel b'zeh gam tzorach cholesh she'en bo sakana. Ve'im yesh tzorach levashel b'Shabbat tzorach cholesh she'en bo sakana. If you have to cook for somebody, so then it's better. Yesh la'adif b'Shabbat b'mikrogal. By the way, I'll just say, without getting into the details, also a question which comes up in terms of Bishul Aklum, right? And very, very practical questions that you have. Somebody has a non-Jewish helper at home, who needs to cook food for them, who needs to warm up food for them. So it would be preferable to use a microwave than other things, because that's not considered cooking. Okay, let's look now at the other question.
Cooking is almost there, and usually making sure that the lights come on and everything else. And the microwave.
Well, again, both are prohibitions. They're two separate things.
Exactly.
Right.
I mean, when you say here, the microwave, still turning on some electrical components.
Right. So here he's talking about a case further where there is sakana, so it's pickup method, or it's about
Are you thinking about the conclusion? It is preferable to use a microwave for cooking. This is the method of sakana. It is a question of something being grilled, and this is the easy type of food and cooking. we're doing other things.
Yeah.
And not becoming all.
Yeah.
And so on and so forth.
So
Why that, if there's no construction,
yeah. So I think I think the answer would be this. The answer would be number one, that with most contraption that you have nowadays, the lights and everything is you're still going to have that. So if it's using, if it's operating the electricity and cooking, or just operating the electricity, so that would trump it. But also it's possible that depending on how it works, depending on the mechanism, those may only be Surei D'Rabbanan versus Surei D'Oraita. It may be there you're doing that indirectly. The fact that the sound is coming on when you finish, I didn't directly turn that on, right? And that may be a lower level, in this case, maybe a lower level prohibition. But the main melacha of cooking, which I'm not doing, so that would be that. I think so. Okay, let's talk a few minutes left. Talk about this question of solar water heating systems, the dud shemesh. Based on what we've said, it's a very, very interesting discussion. Also, an interesting historical discussion here as well. The Shemirat Shabbat Hilchot, you'll see there are 3 editions that were published of the Shemirat Shabbat Hilchot. There was the 2.5. Right? There was the first edition, and then there was the second edition. The third edition was only part 1, and unfortunately, part 2 was never completed before Noah passed away. But he actually changed his opinion on this from the first edition to the second edition in terms of using a dud shemesh. In the first one, he's lenient, and in the second one, he becomes more stringent. We'll see why. There are essentially 2 primary concerns when it comes to the dud shemesh. Let's skip for a moment. At the end of the shir, as you know, in every one of these shirim, we have these essays at the end, the essays written by the graduates of Manigut Toranit, the program in Eretz Chemda. Here there's a little bit of an essay related to the use of solar water heating systems. I just want to show you there is a technical description on page 338. Page 338 at the bottom of the left-hand paragraph, you'll see it says as follows. It says cold water enters the hot water tank through a hose attached at its bottom. Right, so you have this tank of water. We're talking about a dud shemesh. And there are different models and different ways. And with all of these questions, part of the difficulty is the technology is changing so often. You look at the shutim, which were written, when it comes to electricity, for example, there are a lot of misconceptions about what the halachic prohibition of electricity is, because the very first shuvot that were written about electricity relate to certain types of mechanisms. We talk about incandescent light bulbs, and almost everybody agrees, never everybody, but almost everybody agrees that an incandescent light bulb is a violation of esh. It's a violation of lighting fire on Shabbat. And therefore, if you go and ask, even today, you go and ask people in the street, go and ask learned people, try an experiment after this year, go and stop somebody in the street and say, excuse me, why can't we turn on lights on Shabbat? Many people will tell you, because it's a prohibition of turning on a fire. Okay? Nowadays, with LED lights, that is completely untrue. There is nobody who says that turning on LED lights is a prohibition of fire. There are those who say it's biblical, there are those who say it's Rabbanan. Everybody says you shouldn't do it, but different reasons why. But we're left with this conception or this misconception, because that's what was once upon a time. And again, the speed, the rate of change of technology is always far greater, happens at a far greater pace than certainly the written word can necessarily catch up with. So we have to understand exactly what we're talking about. And again, there are different models and different types of things, so it becomes confusing. But the basic principle is like this. So you have your tank of water. The cold water enters, okay, it says like this. Cold water enters the hot water tank through a hose attached at its bottom. Inside the tank, there is special piping, which includes a heating element that traps heat generated by the sun in order to heat the water as it passes through the piping. When the water inside the piping reaches the desired temperature, it's then sent to the top of the tank to be used, right? And the water, when I turn on my faucet tap inside my house, the water that's coming is from the top of the tank. This cycle continues till all the water in the tank has been heated to the desired temperature. The hottest water is that which is at the top, and from there it flows throughout the house whenever hot water faucet is turned on. Okay, so essentially, let me show you, Rabbi Kenigsberg has a nice diagram as well, which helps to kind of how things work. Hopefully you can see that. But essentially, here we have our dud, we have our tank of water, but the cold water enters through here, and the hot water at the top, that goes out and goes to my house. Now, in between that, here we have the solar panels, right? And so there's piping that takes the water from the tank through there to be heated up and comes back. So there are essentially 2 questions that I have when it comes to this. The water that's being heated up, right? As we've learned, what's the melacha? What are we dealing with? We're dealing with the melacha of cooking, right? Cold water, which becomes hot water, reaches the temperature of Yad Soleret. There is no question here. We're getting to Yad Soleret. That is fact. If it's heated up by fire, that's going to be a prohibition of cooking. If it's heated up by the sun, that's not cooking. If it's heated up by derivatives of the sun, as we said, because we're concerned of coming to the derivatives of fire, that is cooking. So the question number one is this: our water is being heated by these solar panels. Are those considered the sun, in which case it would be permitted, or are they considered derivatives of the sun, in which case it would be forbidden? That's one question. A second question I have is, sometimes the water that's heated is not just heated from but it's the water that's heated in the tank. I have the water, the hot water, the cold water comes in, and it's heated by the fact that it comes into contact with the hot water. So that's certainly not by the sun. That's only by derivatives. So in an ironic sort of way, that's a reason to be more stringent. On the other hand, when I turn on the hot water, right, what am I doing? When I turn on the tap, it's not like I'm now starting this whole I inadvertently am beginning this whole process of the water going there and coming in and being cooked, etc. But that's not my intention. My intention is to use the hot water to wash the dishes or whatever it is. So, and again, I just have to say, there's going to be a big difference between Shabbat and Yom Tov in the Shabbat. Remember, on Yom Tov, we're allowed to cook, we're allowed to light transfer fire. Okay, so Yom Tov is going to be much more lenient than Shabbat. There are still certain restrictions. But so you might say, when I turn on the tap, it just so happens that I'm causing now the water to be cooked, even if I am causing the water to be cooked. But it's indirect, therefore it's grama. Maybe it goes to what we spoke about, was it last week, the whole concept of psik reisha, right? Psik reisha, which is when I don't intend to perform a melacha. I do action A, as a result, action B, which is a melacha, will certainly take place, but that was not my intent. That is permitted if the melacha is not certainly going to happen. If the melacha is certainly necessarily going to happen, that's a psik reisha, and that is forbidden. Unless, that's what we call it, psik reisha de lo nichale. If it's a psik reisha de lo nichale, meaning I'm not interested in that outcome, even though it's definitely going to happen, that may be permitted. According to Starling, if it's a psik reisha de lo nichale midrabanan, okay, then it's going to be permitted. According to Ashkenazim, it's still not. So this is one of the big points of contention. Give you a spoiler before we see the sources inside. Rabbi Yosef builds, he has a long tshuva related to shemesh. He builds to a large extent on the fact that even if I'm heating up the water, it's a psik reisha de lo nichale, and it's b'drabanan, maybe it's indirect, or whatever, and therefore he says mutar. That helps society. It doesn't help Ashkenazim because we're right. So we have to say
use that much water. Like we did it with you.
So we have to talk. We have to say, is that correct in terms of how much am I using? When am I using? There might be a difference if I'm using water on Friday night, or I'm using water on Shabbat. Okay. Yeah. What you want to say?
Going back to Ramon's diagram.
Yes.
I'm not sure it's right because it seems that the new water coming into replace old water doesn't go into the dude and then to the solar collector. It goes into the solar collector and then into the dude. So it's never, the cold water doesn't go into the dude until it goes to the collector and then gets
right. So
the only thing that you don't have hot and cold water together in this scenario.
Okay, no. So you're right. There may be. I think I actually saw that there is a dispute in terms of that, or maybe he brings that there's dispute in terms of that point, right? But the main question, certainly what the poskim discuss, is in terms of the collectors. In terms of the collector, right? How do I view that? That is the primary question. If I view that as the fact is it's there, it's heated from the sun, and right. Or do I say, no, at the end of the day, that collector has absorbed, the panel has absorbed the heat of the sun, and that's what's now, that is considered secondary heat when it's heating up the water, and that's going to be forbidden. So let's see what the poskim have to say about this. Source number 21, I think this is from the first edition of Shemat, no, it's from the second edition of Shemat Shabbat.
What page are we on?
We're on page 309. He says, בעיקר דיני בישול בשמש יש לעיין, אולי בזמן הזה שמפיקים חום מכוח השמש יש מקום לאסור הבישול, Okay, that relates to what we discussed, what we discussed previously. But let's see. Over the next page 310, source number 22. You have the Shuk Minchat Yitzchak. Minchat Yitzchak of Weiss from the Edah Haredit. He says, "Ima Metziut Badud Shemesh, Damaim Sonanim Nichnasin Lehedya Toch Maim Achamim." Okay, so this is the point you just raised. We're not sure if it may have been. There may have been models where this was the way it worked. Maybe nowadays that's not it's not so common. But he says if the cold water is mixing with the hot water, so then as if the mishum ta'ati mishum bishul b'todot ha'chama mishum atmanah. Says that would certainly be forbidden. I don't think we have in here actually the discussion, which is the main discussion in terms of whether I call it chama or I call it todot ha'chama. I don't see it in here, but I'll just tell you. So Rabbi Kenigsberg in his sefer, I think it was the Tzitz Eliezer was the one who said. Tzitz Eliezer was the one who said that it is considered bishul b'shemesh.
I mean, it's in the summer, maybe you're looking at the front 238.
So the Tzitz Eliezer, he says that you collect, they're just concentrating heat of the sun, but that's considered it's heated up in the sun, and therefore that would not be a problem. As opposed to the Minchat Yitzchak, further on in different places, maybe in this Tzurba, he actually says, no, we don't consider them to be the shemesh, we consider it to be derivative of the shemesh, so that is one point here. The Har Tzvi, right, of Tzvi Pesach Fran, in source number 23, he says, in any event, he says, even if you do say it's Toladot, and again, the fact that it's Toladot Shemesh, it's going to be in Isur D'Rabbanan, it's not going to be in Isur D'Oraita. So he says, Benidon Didan Lo Ave Ala Grama. At the end of the day, what I'm doing is only indirectly causing what to be heated. And he said, normally, as we discussed last week, normally we say that grama would still be forbidden. Over here, since it's only Yisur D'Rabbanan in the first place, so now it's two D'Rabbanans. The trade D'Rabbanan b'vaday yesh la'atir be'ino mitkaven u'psik reisha. She says a psik reisha be'ino mitkaven or two D'Rabbanans we can allow. Okay, so here you see number 24. Shmarat Shabbat Hilchot. In his first edition, again he was lenient. He says Zer shemitchamamim hamayim hakarim leit lanba davay psik reisha davay patmei. Shalin number b'D'Rabbanan alluded to previously. The difference between psik reisha v'lo nichalei, psik reisha v'lo patmei. Okay, more than we can go into now. But by the second edition, he says no. Another factor which comes into it is Rav Shlomo points out that one may come to be confused sometimes, especially nowadays. You have systems whereby you have an electric boiler and sun heater which are really working together. And then he says, sometimes you have an electric boiler. You might take out the water, you might get confused, and you're taking out water which has been cooked, right, by the electricity, and that would certainly be forbidden. The bottom line is, we find Shitot Lekan Lekan, as I said, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is Mekel. Again, from Sfaradim, it's certainly more easier to be lenient. There are good reasons to be stringent in terms of not to use a shemesh, but many poskim might that in a shatat chak, if you need for young children or for choleh, etc., that there is room to be lenient as well. Again, source will end with this, page 312. Let's just see his summary. Rav Melamed says the following. Okay, so you could say that it's todot derivatives, and therefore it would be forbidden. Exactly what Shalom said before, that at the end of the day, you are happy with the result because you want more water to get heated up. If it's on Friday night, you don't want more water going in because everything's going to be cold. Then there's no sun to heat the water up. It's all going to stay cold till the morning. לכן בליל שבת מותר להשתמש במים החמים שבלול. So he holds that on Friday night there is more room to actually use the hot water in the dur, but in the day one should be more stringent. And then he says number 27, נשת הדחק, ייתכן שגם ביום אפשר להשתמש בחמים שנותרו מערב שבת, מצירוף שתי ספרות. Again, we're talking about the water that's been heated up before Shabbat. But he says, number one, אולי אפשר להחשיב פעולה זאת לדרמה, maybe it's just drama indirect. Number two, דעת מיעוט הפוסקים הסוברים שתדרש בדרבנן אינו אסור. So bottom line, he says as well, during the day, to use the shemesh would be better to be stringent, but בשעת הדחק there is what's around. Okay, Ad Kan. Next week we'll discuss, start looking at the laws of Bishul and Bishul. I think maybe we'll get into Rishon, Sheni, etc. We will have new books with Ad Hashem. So volume 18, that's next week, see you all then.
Okay.